All right, everybody, get ready, because today we're going deep, 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 deep into some seriously mind-bending territory. We're talking medical breakthroughs, kind of sci-fi stuff, and honestly, a whole lot of ethical questions. Just imagine cells that never die.
It sounds crazy, right? But it's a real story.
It's a real story.
And both incredible and deeply unsettling.
So tell me more about that.
So it all starts with this woman named Henrietta Lacks.
Henrietta Lacks.
An African-American woman diagnosed with cervical cancer back in 1951.
1951.
And sadly, she didn't survive the year. But her cells, they had a different kind of legacy.
Okay, so these cells, they're like the Energizer bunny of the body. They just keep going and going. What's the deal with that?
Well, you see, most cells in our bodies have a built-in limit on how many times they can divide.
Like a biological clock.
Exactly like a biological clock.
Ticking away.
Ticking away. And that limit is governed by something called telomeres, which are like protective caps on the ends of our chromosomes.
Telomeres, okay.
Every time a cell divides, these telomeres get a bit shorter. Eventually, they get so short the cell just can't divide anymore.
Okay, that makes sense. But what's different about Henrietta Lacks cells? Why didn't they get the memo about this whole telomere thing?
That is the million-dollar question, and it's part of what makes this story so fascinating. For reasons that scientists still don't fully understand, Henrietta Lacks cells had an unusual ability to rebuild their telomeres.
So they figured out a way around the system.
Basically, this means they could essentially divide indefinitely, becoming the first immortal human cell line.
Wow. The first immortal human cell line.
They were dubbed HeLa cells in her honor.
HeLa cells. Got it. So we've got these never-say-die cells on our hands. What's the big deal? What impact did they actually have?
Okay, so think of it this way. Before HeLa cells, scientists were working with human cells that would just die off quickly.
Right, because of those telomeres.
Yeah, it was like trying to build a house on a foundation of sand.
Oh, I see. Yeah, that's not a good foundation.
HeLa cells provided a stable and readily available source of human cells for research, which was absolutely revolutionary.
Okay, so we're talking about a major game changer for science.
Yeah.
Give me some specifics. What kind of breakthroughs came from these HeLa cells?
Well, for one, they were instrumental in developing the polio vaccine. Jonas Salk,
Oh, wow.
the scientist who developed the vaccine, used HeLa cells to test and refine his work.
To test and refine his work.
Yeah. It's hard to overstate the impact of that vaccine. It quite literally saved millions of lives.
Wow, that's huge. So we're talking about a medical miracle, all thanks to these HeLa cells. Anything else?
Oh, there's a lot more. HeLa cells have been used in countless studies on cancer, helping scientists understand how cancer cells grow and spread. They've been used to study the effects of radiation, toxins.
Toxins.
Even to test the effectiveness of cosmetics.
Cosmetics. That's kind of a weird juxtaposition. These amazing life-saving cells used to test lipstick and face cream.
It speaks to the versatility of these cells. They've become a fundamental tool in so many areas of research. And here's a truly mind-blowing example. HeLa cells were even sent into space.
Space. Now that's just cool. What on earth were they doing up there?
Scientists wanted to understand how human cells behave in a microgravity environment.
Makes sense.
Yeah, it's crucial information for long-term space travel.
Right.
Sending HeLa cells into space allowed researchers to study how microgravity affects cell division, growth, and even gene expression.
Wow. So from polio to space exploration, it sounds like HeLa cells have had their hand in just about everything. But didn't you say there was an ethical shadow hanging over this whole story?
Absolutely. While Henrietta Lacks' cells were busy changing the world,
Right.
She and her family had absolutely no idea. Her cells were taken without her knowledge or consent.
Hold up. Without her consent. You're telling me doctors just took her cells and did whatever they wanted with them? How is that even possible?
Unfortunately, it was a different time back then. The concept of informed consent, the idea that patients have a right to know and agree to how their tissues are used, wasn't as established as it is today.
Oh, so it was just different back then.
Yeah. And to complicate matters further, Henrietta Lacks was a Black woman in a healthcare system rife with racial injustice.
So you're saying that her race played a role in how she was treated, or rather, mistreated.
It's impossible to ignore the context of that era. Segregation was still the law of the land in many parts of the country, and Black patients often received substandard care.
It's kind of hard to believe that was so recent.
Yeah. The fact that Henrietta Lacks was never told about her cells, never given a choice in the matter, speaks volumes about the power imbalances of the time.
Okay, so we've got this incredible scientific advancement built on a foundation that sounds, well, ethically shaky at best. And on top of that, I imagine Henrietta Lacks' family didn't exactly see a windfall from all these HeLa cell profits, right?
You're right. While pharmaceutical companies and research institutions were profiting from HeLa cells,
It's kind of crazy to think about that.
Henrietta Lacks' family lived in poverty for decades,
Oh, wow.
completely unaware of the incredible legacy their mother's cells had created.
That's just wrong on so many levels, like the ultimate insult to injury. But this story is making me think, we donate blood all the time.
Huh.
What happens to that? I mean, it's part of me. Is there some scientist out there with a vial of my blood under a microscope?
That's a great question, and it brings us to the heart of some really complex issues about ownership, consent, and the commercialization of human biological material.
So many questions.
We'll delve into all that in a little bit, but first, let's take a closer look at who Henrietta Lacks was as a person.
Let's do it. Because this is more than just a science story.
Right.
This is a human story. And it's time we really got to know the woman behind the world-famous cells. Welcome back, everybody. Before we were talking about how Henrietta Lacks' cells were taken without her knowledge or consent. And it makes you think twice about routine medical procedures. Like, what rights do we actually have over our own bodies?
It's a question that's been debated for decades, and honestly, there's no easy answer. But the controversy surrounding HeLa cells definitely brought it to the forefront. It forced people to start thinking about who owns our cells, who profits from them, and what say, if any, patients should have in all of this.
So what's the legal side of this? Are there laws now that protect patients' rights when it comes to their tissues and cells?
The legal landscape is complex, and it's evolved over time. A key turning point was a 1988 case involving a man named John Moore,
John Moore.
who had leukemia.
Okay.
His doctor took some of his cells and, without Moore's knowledge, developed a cell line from them that ended up being incredibly valuable. Moore sued, claiming property rights over his cells and a share of the profits.
That sounds kind of like the Henrietta Lacks situation, but maybe with a bit more legal awareness on the patient's side. So what happened? Did Moore win his case?
Unfortunately, no. The California Supreme Court ultimately ruled that patients don't have property rights over their discarded cells.
Wait, so you're telling me that if a doctor takes my cells, they basically have free rein to do whatever they want with them? That doesn't seem right.
Well, the court's decision wasn't based on ethics, it was based on existing property law. The ruling emphasized that once cells are removed from the body, they're no longer considered part of the person, at least in the legal sense. And while the ruling in the Moore case didn't go the way many people hoped, it did have one positive outcome. It emphasized the importance of informed consent.
Okay, so at least there's some recognition that patients should be in the loop. But back to the issue of profits, did Henrietta Lacks' family ever get any compensation for the use of her cells? I mean, these cells have been used in countless research projects, even helping to develop commercial products.
It took a long time, but in recent years there have been some settlements. In 2021, a biotech company that had used HeLa cells extensively agreed to compensate the Lacks family.
Well, at least that's something. But I imagine no amount of money can truly make up for what happened.
You're right. The impact of HeLa cells is immeasurable. They've touched millions of lives. And while financial compensation is important, it's also about acknowledging the harm that was done, honoring Henrietta Lacks' legacy, and ensuring that history doesn't repeat itself.
Okay, so we've talked about the legal battles and the ethics, but let's not forget the incredible science that's come out of all of this. What are some of the recent discoveries we can thank HeLa cells for? Are they still being used today?
Oh, absolutely. HeLa cells are still hard at work in labs around the world. They've been instrumental in developing new cancer treatments, including groundbreaking immunotherapies that help the body's own immune system fight cancer. They have also been crucial in understanding and developing treatments for HIV/AIDS.
Wow, so they're still playing a vital role in medical research. It's amazing to think that these cells, taken from one woman over 70 years ago, are still driving scientific innovation today. But I have to wonder, what would Henrietta Lacks think about all of this?
It's a question we can only ponder. Given what we know about her, her strong family ties, her resilience, I think it's safe to say that she would want her story to serve as a catalyst for positive change.
I think you're right. And speaking of positive change, one thing that's always struck me about this story is how it's forced the scientific community to confront some really uncomfortable truths about its past.
Absolutely. Henrietta Lacks' story exposed some deep-seated ethical problems within scientific research, particularly when it comes to vulnerable populations. But it also ignited a movement for change.
And it seems like that movement is still gaining momentum. In recent years, we've seen growing calls for more diversity and inclusion in scientific research, more sensitivity towards the needs and concerns of underrepresented communities. Do you think that shift, at least in part, can be traced back to Henrietta Lacks?
I think there's a definite connection. Her story serves as a powerful reminder that science is not just about cells and data, it's about people. And it's about ensuring that the pursuit of knowledge doesn't come at the expense of human dignity and respect.
Well said. Now, we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, but before we wrap things up, there's one more aspect of this story we need to explore. The enduring impact of Henrietta Lacks' story on the field of bioethics. That's what we'll pick up next time. Welcome back to the deep dive, everybody. We've been talking about the incredible story of Henrietta Lacks, her immortal cells, and the ethical quagmire that followed.
A story that really forces us to confront some uncomfortable truths about the history of science and medicine, especially when it comes to race, class, and consent.
Exactly. And in this final part, we're going to really zoom in on how Henrietta Lacks' story has shaped the field of bioethics. Because this isn't just about one woman's cells, it's about the very principles that guide scientific research.
You hit the nail on the head. Henrietta Lacks' story was a wake-up call. Before her story came to light, informed consent was often treated as an afterthought, especially when it came to tissue samples.
So you're saying that patients often had no idea what was happening to their cells or tissues? That's wild to me. How did things change?
The public outcry over Henrietta Lacks' case was a turning point. It put a spotlight on the lack of transparency and respect for patient autonomy.
Really shine the light on it.
Yeah, that existed in many research settings.
So Henrietta Lacks, even though she wasn't a scientist or an ethicist, ended up having a profound impact on the way research is conducted today.
Absolutely. Her story became a catalyst for change. It led to the development of stricter regulations and guidelines like the Common Rule, which mandates informed consent for federally funded research involving human subjects.
Okay, so the Common Rule. Remind me again what that's all about.
It's essentially a set of ethical principles and regulations that govern research involving human participants. One of its key provisions is the requirement for informed consent.
Okay.
This means that researchers have to clearly explain to potential participants what the research involves, the risks, the benefits, and how their data and tissues will be used.
Right.
And participants have to give their voluntary agreement before they can be enrolled in the study.
Okay, so thanks to Henrietta Lacks, patients now have more say in what happens to their own bodies and their biological materials.
Exactly. The goal is to ensure that what happened to Henrietta her cells being taken and used without her knowledge or consent never happens again.
That makes sense. But informed consent is just one piece of the puzzle, right? The story also raises bigger questions about how we value and respect the contributions of individuals, particularly those from marginalized communities.
You're absolutely right. Henrietta Lacks' story is inseparable from the larger conversation about race, poverty, and healthcare disparities. She was a Black woman treated in a segregated hospital at a time when Black patients were often subjected to unethical medical practices.
It's a sobering reminder that scientific progress doesn't happen in a vacuum. It's influenced by social and political forces.
Absolutely.
And those forces can sometimes lead to exploitation and injustice.
Exactly. Henrietta Lacks' story compels us to look beyond the science and acknowledge the human stories behind every biological sample. It's a call for greater sensitivity, awareness, and accountability within the research community.
And it seems like that call is being answered, at least to some degree. In recent years, we've seen a growing movement to address diversity and inclusion in scientific research. Do you think that shift can be traced back to Henrietta Lacks?
Without a doubt. Her story has had a ripple effect, raising awareness about the historical injustices and systemic biases that have long plagued scientific research.
So it's not just about cells in science. It's about justice and equity.
Exactly. Henrietta Lacks' story is a powerful reminder that scientific progress and ethical responsibility must go hand in hand.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground today. From the incredible science of HeLa cells to the ethical quagmire they unearth, it's been quite a journey.
It's a story that's both fascinating and deeply unsettling, but ultimately, it's a story of hope.
Hope? How so?
Because Henrietta Lacks' story, while tragic in many ways, has led to meaningful changes in the way research is conducted. It's forced us to confront difficult questions about consent, ownership, and the commercialization of human biological materials. And it's sparked a movement for greater diversity, equity, and ethical awareness in science.
It's a legacy that goes far beyond the lab.
Absolutely. It's a legacy that continues to challenge us to strive for a more just and equitable future. A future where scientific progress is truly a force for good in the world.
And on that note, we wrap up our deep dive into the incredible world of Henrietta Lacks and the HeLa cells. Thank you all for joining us.